I never thought I would become the neighborhood villain for following the exact letter of the law. But when Karen Hutchins from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA called me at 6 in the morning during the worst snowstorm Colorado Springs had seen in 15 years, I knew my peaceful Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. "Ethan Sanderson, this is unacceptable." Her shrill voice pierced through my phone speaker before I had even properly opened my eyes. The HOA bylaws clearly state that all residents must maintain snow removal for common areas adjacent to their property, and you have neglected this duty for far too long. I sat up in bed, squinting at the clock. 6:15. Outside my window, snow was still falling heavily, accumulating on everything in sight. I had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, paid my dues on time, kept my lawn immaculate, and generally stayed out of everyone's way. I worked from home as a software engineer, which meant I rarely bothered anyone and certainly did not cause problems. "Karen, I cleared my driveway and walkway yesterday evening," I said, trying to keep my voice even despite being woken up before sunrise. "What are you talking about?" Section 14. Paragraph 3 of the revised HOA guidelines that were passed last month, she snapped. "All residents within 50 feet of community access roads must ensure those roads remain clear during winter weather events. Your property borders Maple Drive for approximately 75 feet, which means you are responsible for snow removal on that entire stretch." I pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at it for a moment, certain I had misheard. "You want me to clear a public road?" "It is a community road, not a public road, as it falls within our HOA boundaries. And yes, you and the 3 other homeowners along that stretch are responsible. I have already contacted them as well. This needs to be completed by noon today, or you will face a fine of $200 per day until compliance is achieved." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there in the dim morning light, my mind trying to process what had just happened. I had not received any notice about revised guidelines. I checked my mail from the past month, everything. Nothing. But knowing Karen and her cronies on the HOA board, they probably claimed they had sent it and that my failure to receive it was my problem, not theirs. For those unfamiliar with HOA politics, let me paint you a picture. Karen Hutchins was a 52-year-old woman who had moved into Meadowbrook Heights about 8 years ago and had immediately made it her life's mission to control every aspect of the neighborhood. She had perfectly styled blonde hair that she got done twice a week, drove a white Mercedes SUV, and wore designer athletic wear despite never actually exercising. Her husband, Greg, was a dentist who worked long hours, probably to avoid being home with her. They had 2 grown children who visited maybe once a year, which should tell you something. Karen had gotten herself elected as HOA president 4 years ago and had since packed the board with her friends, Linda Morrison, Brenda Patterson, and Joyce Chen. Together, they formed what the neighborhood had started calling the Fun Police, constantly creating new rules and finding violations where none existed. They had fined old Mr. Henderson $300 because his mailbox was painted forest green instead of the approved hunter green. They had threatened the Kowalskis with legal action because their daughter's pink playhouse was visible from the street. They had tried to ban basketball hoops, garden gnomes, and at one point, even wind chimes. But this was a new level of absurdity. I got dressed, made coffee, and went outside to assess the situation. The snow was still coming down steadily, already adding another 3 inches to the foot that had fallen overnight. Maple Drive, the street in question, was completely blanketed. It was a quiet side street that maybe saw 20 cars a day, mostly residents coming and going. The main roads were the city's responsibility, but apparently this little stretch was now mine. My neighbor, Frank Chen, was already outside with his snowblower, looking about as thrilled as I felt. Frank was Joyce's husband, but unlike his wife, he was a reasonable guy who kept his head down and tried to stay out of HOA drama. "Can you believe this?" he called over the sound of his machine. "Joyce told me this morning that I had to clear the street. I thought she was joking." "Karen called me too," I shouted back. "Did you know about any revised guidelines?" Frank shook his head. "First I am hearing of it, but you know how they are. They probably voted on it at one of those special emergency meetings they hold without telling anyone." He was probably right. The HOA board had a habit of holding emergency sessions with barely any notice, technically meeting the minimum legal requirement for notification, but ensuring that no one who might disagree could actually attend. I went back inside and pulled up the HOA bylaws on my computer. I read through the entire document, including all amendments. Section 14, paragraph 3 did exist, but it had been modified with language so vague and convoluted that it could mean almost anything. The key phrase was "residents shall maintain reasonable access to community thoroughfares adjacent to their property boundaries during inclement weather." The word "reasonable" was doing a lot of heavy lifting there. I called my other neighbor, Pete Williams, who lived on the other side of me. Pete was a firefighter who worked 24-hour shifts, and he was not going to be happy about this. "They want me to what?" Pete's voice was thick with sleep. He had just gotten home from a shift that morning. "Ethan, I have been awake for 26 hours fighting a structure fire in Manitou Springs. Tell Karen she can come clear it herself." "I hear you, man, but she is threatening $200 a day fines." "Let her try. I will see her in court." Pete hung up, and I could not blame him. The man literally saved lives for a living, and now he was being harassed about snow removal on a street that the city snowplows would get to eventually anyway. I decided to go talk to Karen in person. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe we could work something out. I was an optimist back then. The HOA president lived in one of the largest houses in the neighborhood, a sprawling 2-story colonial with a circular driveway and professionally maintained landscaping. I noticed, as I pulled up, that her driveway and walkways were immaculately clear. Someone had been out here early with professional equipment. Karen answered the door in her typical uniform, expensive yoga pants, a designer fleece, and an expression that suggested she was already annoyed before even seeing who was knocking. "Ethan, I assume you are here to confirm that you have started on the snow removal. Karen, can we talk about this? I never received any notification about these new guidelines, and frankly, asking residents to clear public streets seems beyond the scope of what an HOA can mandate." "Community streets, not public," she corrected, not inviting me in despite the cold. "And the guidelines were posted on the community website and mailed to all residents. If you did not receive your copy, that is unfortunately your responsibility to stay informed." I checked the website regularly. There was nothing there. It was posted on November 15th in the members-only section. I never got login credentials for a members-only section. Karen sighed dramatically. "I will have Linda send you the information again." Regardless, ignorance of the rules is not an excuse for non-compliance. The snow needs to be cleared by noon. I glanced at my watch. It was 7:30. "Karen, it is still snowing. Even if I clear it now, it will just be covered again in an hour." "Then I suggest you work quickly and efficiently." "Good morning, Ethan." She closed the door in my face. I sat in my truck for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm down. I was not an angry person by nature. I generally believed in following rules and being a good neighbor. But this was ridiculous. This was a power trip, plain and simple. I drove home and started looking into the legality of what Karen was demanding. After 2 hours of research and a consultation with a lawyer friend in Denver, I learned that HOAs in Colorado did indeed have broad powers, but they had to follow their own procedures. Any changes to bylaws required proper notice to all homeowners and typically a vote. These revised guidelines Karen kept mentioning seemed questionable at best, but fighting it would take time and money. Filing a complaint, going through mediation, potentially ending up in court. Meanwhile, the fines would keep accumulating. I decided to comply, but I was going to be creative about it. I owned a decent truck with a plow attachment that I had bought used the previous winter. I used it to clear my driveway and occasionally helped out elderly neighbors. I had never used it on the street before, but technically I could. I also owned a snowblower, a couple of shovels, and most importantly, I had a thorough understanding of property boundaries and technical compliance. By 10 in the morning, I was outside with my equipment. Frank was finishing up his section, looking exhausted. The fourth homeowner on our stretch, Maria Lopez, was outside with a shovel, clearly struggling. Maria was a single mother with 2 young kids and worked 2 jobs. This was the last thing she needed. "Maria, let me help you," I called over. "Ethan, I cannot afford a fine right now," she said, and I could hear the stress in her voice. "But I do not have a snowblower and this is too much to shovel. I will take care of it. Do not worry." I spent the next hour clearing Maria's section with my plow, then did my own. The snow had finally stopped falling around 11, which was lucky. By noon, Maple Drive was clear, at least the sections adjacent to our properties. I took photos, time-stamped them, and sent them to Karen's email as documentation. Her response came within 5 minutes. "Acceptable. Be advised that ongoing monitoring will occur." That afternoon, I stewed. I cleaned up, went back inside, and tried to work, but I could not focus. The injustice of it gnawed at me. Karen had essentially made up a rule to exert control, and we had all just jumped to comply because the alternative was expensive fines and legal headaches. Then, I started thinking about the technical aspects. The revised guideline said I had to clear community thoroughfares adjacent to my property. It said nothing about where I had to put the snow. Most people, when clearing snow, just pushed it to the sides, onto their lawn or the shoulder of the road. But technically, that snow had to go somewhere. And the HOA did own several common areas, including the community clubhouse with its large parking lot. The clubhouse was Karen's pride and joy. It was where the HOA held meetings, where neighborhood events happened, and most importantly, it was where Karen held her twice-weekly book club, her weekly yoga class, and her monthly social committee gatherings. The building itself was nice enough, a renovated ranch-style structure with a meeting room, a kitchen, and a large front porch. The parking lot could hold about 30 cars. An idea started forming. Over the next few days, the weather cleared, and things seemed to return to normal. I worked. Maria thanked me several times for helping her out, and Frank grumbled about his wife's HOA activities, but otherwise stayed quiet. Then the next storm hit. Colorado weather is unpredictable, and what the meteorologists had predicted as a light dusting turned into another major snowfall. This time, Karen called at 5 in the morning. "Ethan, I expect full compliance by 10 today." She did not even identify herself or offer a greeting, just the demand. I looked outside. "Another 8 inches, maybe more." "I will take care of it," I said and hung up. I got dressed, had breakfast, and then loaded my truck with every piece of snow removal equipment I owned. I also hitched up a small utility trailer that I normally used for hauling yard waste. I started on my section of Maple Drive just after 7. But this time, instead of pushing the snow to the side, I loaded it into the trailer. Scoop by scoop, plow load by plow load. It was slower, much slower, but I was thorough. When the trailer was full, I drove it over to the clubhouse and dumped it right in the parking lot entrance. Then I went back and got more. By 9:30, I had made 4 trips. The clubhouse parking lot entrance was blocked by a growing mountain of snow. I had cleared my section of Maple Drive completely, documented it with photos, and technically, I had placed the snow on HOA common property, which was perfectly legal. Frank saw what I was doing on my 3rd trip and came over. "Ethan, what are you doing?" clearing the street like Karen asked. "The snow has to go somewhere." He looked at the growing pile, then at me, then back at the pile. Slowly, a grin spread across his face. "You know what? I have a trailer too, the more the merrier." Frank joined me, and together we made several more trips. Maria even helped, using her kids' sleds to move smaller loads, which we added to our trailers. By noon, the clubhouse parking lot was inaccessible. There was a wall of snow about 6 feet high and 20 feet wide blocking the entire entrance. I sent Karen an email with photos showing that Maple Drive was clear and that all snow had been responsibly relocated to HOA common property. My phone rang 30 seconds later. "What have you done?" Karen's voice was so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "I cleared the street as requested and placed the snow on community property." "Is there a problem? You blocked the clubhouse." "I have yoga in an hour." I complied with the guidelines. Section 14, Paragraph 3 does not specify where the cleared snow must be placed, only that the thoroughfare must be cleared. This is deliberate sabotage. This is compliance. If you would like to specify where snow should be placed, perhaps that could be included in the next revision of the guidelines. With proper notice to all homeowners, of course. I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end. "You will move this immediately." "I do not think so." I completed the required work. Moving the snow again would be an additional service, and I am not obligated to provide that. "I will fine you." "For what?" "I followed your rules." She hung up, and I knew this was not over. Within an hour, I received an email from the HOA board calling an emergency meeting for that evening at 7. The stated purpose was to address malicious compliance and destruction of community property. I forwarded the email to my lawyer friend, David, and asked him to be on standby. He called me back 20 minutes later, laughing. "Ethan, this is the pettiest, most beautiful thing I've heard all week, but be careful. They are going to try to hit you with fines or claim you damaged property. The snow will melt. How is that property damage? It is not, but they will try. Make sure you document everything. Keep copies of all communications, and if they fine you, do not pay it. Let them take you to court. I would love to see this in front of a judge." That evening, I showed up at the meeting, which was being held at Linda Morrison's house since the clubhouse was still inaccessible. About 20 other homeowners were there, more than usually attended. Word had spread about what happened, and people were curious. Karen sat at the front with her board members, looking furious. She called the meeting to order with barely controlled rage. "We are here tonight because of a deliberate act of vandalism against HOA property," she began. "Point of order," I said, standing up. "I would like to see the documentation supporting that claim. You blocked the clubhouse. I cleared snow from Maple Drive, as required by the guidelines you cited, and placed it on community property. At no point did I damage anything." An older gentleman in the back, Harold Peterson, raised his hand. I would like to know more about these revised guidelines. I do not recall voting on anything about clearing public streets. Community streets, Karen snapped. And the board has the authority to implement reasonable safety measures without a full community vote. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, according to the Colorado Revised Statutes, specifically Section 38-33.3-209.5, HOA boards cannot unilaterally impose financial obligations on homeowners without following proper amendment procedures. Making me responsible for clearing a street under threat of daily fines constitutes a financial obligation. I had done my homework. Karen's face went red. The board acted within its authority. Then I am sure you will not mind if we review the meeting minutes where this was approved, the notice that was sent to homeowners, and the legal opinion you obtained before implementation. Silence. We do not need to justify our decisions to you, Linda finally said. Actually, you do. That is literally how HOAs work. The meeting devolved into chaos. Other homeowners started chiming in with their own complaints about Karen and the board. The Kowalskis brought up the Playhouse incident. Mr. Henderson mentioned his mailbox. Pete Williams, who had shown up in his fire department uniform after a shift, stood up and gave a passionate speech about how he had better things to do than clear streets for an HOA that spent its money on decorative benches no one used instead of actual snow removal services. Karen tried to regain control but failed miserably. Eventually, she just started shouting over everyone that I was fined $500 for destruction of property, and that if the snow was not moved by morning, it would be another $500 per day. Send me the invoice, I said calmly. I will see you in court. I left, and about half the homeowners left with me. Over the next week, things escalated. Karen sent me daily emails about the fines, which I ignored. The snow pile at the clubhouse slowly melted, but it took almost 10 days because of the sheer volume and the fact that temperatures stayed below freezing most days. During that time, Karen had to cancel 3 events. Her yoga class met at someone's house instead. The book club was postponed. And most embarrassingly, the HOA's annual winter social had to be rescheduled. Other homeowners started coming to me with stories. Apparently, Karen and the board had been pulling similar stunts for years, just usually on a smaller scale. Nitpicky fines, selective enforcement of rules, using HOA funds for things that primarily benefited board members. Someone suggested a recall election. In Colorado, HOA members can petition to remove board members if enough homeowners sign on. We needed 40% of the community, which meant about 60 signatures out of the 150 homes in Meadowbrook Heights. I was not sure it would work, but I agreed to help organize it. We spent the next 3 weeks gathering signatures. It was easier than expected. People were fed up. Even some of Karen's friends started distancing themselves when they realized how unpopular she had become. Meanwhile, Karen followed through on her threat. I received an official invoice for $2,500 in fines. I responded with a letter from David, my lawyer friend, explaining why the fines were illegitimate and inviting the HOA to sue me if they disagreed. They did. In March, I received a summons for small claims court. The HOA was suing me for the fines plus damages for lost revenue from canceled events and emotional distress caused to board members. David was thrilled. This is going to be fun. The court date was set for late April, which gave us plenty of time to prepare. It also gave us plenty of time to finish the recall petition, which we submitted in early April with 78 signatures. Under HOA rules, A recall election had to be held within 30 days of a valid petition. The board tried to challenge the validity, claiming some signatures were forged or that some people who signed were not current on their dues and therefore could not participate. David helped us fight every challenge, and eventually, the election was scheduled for May 3rd. The lawsuit and the recall election created a strange atmosphere in the neighborhood. Some people avoided me, probably worried about angering Karen. Others went out of their way to show support. Maria baked me cookies. Frank bought me a beer. Pete invited me to a barbecue. Karen, for her part, became increasingly erratic. She started driving around the neighborhood looking for violations, taking photos of anything she could possibly find. A car parked slightly over the sidewalk. A trash can left out an hour past pickup. Christmas lights that were not taken down by the arbitrary deadline. She hit me with 3 more fines for various minor issues. I ignored all of them. The court date arrived on a Thursday morning. Small claims court in Colorado Springs was busy, filled with people dealing with everything from security deposit disputes to unpaid bills. David could not officially represent me since lawyers are not used in small claims, but he helped me prepare and sat in the gallery for support. Karen represented the HOA herself, with Linda and Brenda there as witnesses. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Reynolds, called our case. Meadowbrook Heights HOA versus Ethan Sanderson. This is regarding unpaid fines. Miss Hutchins, you are representing the plaintiff. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Sanderson deliberately vandalized community property and has refused to pay legitimate fines. Mr. Sanderson, your response. Your Honor, I complied with an HOA directive to clear snow from a street adjacent to my property. The directive did not specify where to place the snow, so I placed it on HOA common property. No damage occurred. The snow melted naturally. The fines are retaliation for making the HOA board look foolish. Judge Reynolds looked interested now. Let me see the directive. Karen handed over printed copies of the emails and the relevant bylaw section. The judge read through them, her expression unreadable. Miss Hutchins, where in this directive does it specify snow placement? It is implied that residents would not sabotage community facilities. Implied is not the same as specified. Mr. Sanderson, why did you choose the clubhouse parking lot? It was the nearest community property with sufficient space to hold the volume of snow, Your Honor. I made multiple trips over several hours. It was the most practical solution. Did you damage any property? No, Your Honor. Snow melts. The parking lot was usable again within 10 days. Miss Hutchins, do you have evidence of actual damages? Karen fumbled through her papers. We had to cancel events. We lost revenue from facility rentals. How much revenue? 3 events at $50 each, $150. And you are suing for $2,500. The rest is fines for non-compliance and emotional distress. Judge Reynolds set down the papers and looked at Karen over her glasses. Emotional distress. This is small claims court, Miss Hutchins, not a personal injury case. And these fines seem excessive for what was, at best, a dispute over interpretation of vague guidelines. He knew what he was doing, I am sure he did, but that does not mean he violated any rules. Mr. Sanderson, did you clear the street as directed? Yes, Your Honor, completely. I have photos. And did any HOA rule prohibit placing the snow on common property? No, Your Honor. Judge Reynolds flipped through the papers one more time, then looked up. I am dismissing this case. The HOA's guidelines were vague, and Mr. Sanderson complied with the literal requirements. There is no basis for the fines. Additionally, I am advising the HOA to review its policies on implementing new requirements and to ensure that proper notice is given to all homeowners before imposing financial penalties. This seems like a massive waste of everyone's time over what should have been a simple conversation. Karen's face went purple. But, Your Honor, my decision is final. Case dismissed. Next case. We filed out of the courtroom. Karen stormed past me without a word, Linda and Brenda trailing behind her. David clapped me on the shoulder. Clean victory. Now let's see if you can win the election. The recall election was held the following Tuesday at the Clubhouse, which had long since thawed out and been returned to normal use. Turnout was massive. Nearly 100 homeowners showed up to vote, which was unheard of for HOA elections. The way it worked was simple: a yes or no vote on whether to recall the current board. If yes won, a new election would be held immediately for replacement members. Karen and her allies campaigned hard in the final days, going door to door, sending emails, posting on social media. They claimed that the recall was orchestrated by troublemakers who wanted to destroy property values and create chaos. Meanwhile, our side simply reminded people of the facts: the arbitrary fines, the lack of transparency, the petty enforcement, the lawsuit that wasted HOA funds. When the votes were counted, the recall passed with 72% approval. Karen demanded a recount. The vote counters, who were volunteers not aligned with either side, counted again. Same result: the board was out. Immediately following the recall, nominations were opened for new board members. Pete Williams was nominated and elected as president. Maria Lopez agreed to serve as treasurer. Frank Chen became secretary. Two other neighbors, both reasonable people who had been vocal critics of Karen's regime, filled the remaining seats. Pete's first act as president was to review the revised guidelines that had started this whole mess. After consulting with a real HOA attorney, not just Karen's interpretation of the rules, the new board determined that the snow removal requirements were improperly implemented and unenforceable. They were immediately rescinded. The second act was to review the HOA's finances. What they found was concerning. Over the past 4 years, the HOA's funds had been consistently mismanaged. Money that should have gone to actual community improvements like road maintenance and playground equipment had instead been spent on things like expensive landscaping around the clubhouse, decorative items for board members' preferred areas, and even catering for board meetings that was far beyond reasonable. There was also the issue of selective fee waivers. Karen had waived late payment fees for her friends while aggressively pursuing others. She had approved expenditures without proper board votes. And most damning, she had paid herself a monthly administrative fee that was nowhere in the HOA budget or bylaws. Pete called another community meeting in June to present the findings. This time, almost everyone showed up. "We have conducted a full audit of HOA finances," Pete announced. "What we found amounts to misuse of funds, self-dealing, and potentially fraud. The previous board, primarily Karen Hutchins, authorized payments to themselves totaling nearly $18,000 over 4 years without proper authorization or community approval." The room erupted. Karen, who had shown up with her attorney this time, stood up. "This is slander. I did nothing illegal. You paid yourself $700 every month for administrative work that was already covered by our management company," Pete said calmly. "You spent HOA funds on personal expenses by claiming they were for board activities. You waived your own late fees while fining others, and you did it all without transparency or oversight." Karen's attorney leaned over and whispered something to her. She sat down, looking shaken. The new board has consulted with legal counsel, Pete continued. We have grounds to pursue civil action to recover the misappropriated funds. However, we are willing to offer a settlement. If Karen and the other former board members repay the full amount within 90 days, we will not pursue legal action. I watched Karen's face cycle through emotions. Anger, fear, defiance, and finally something that might have been resignation. Her attorney asked for time to respond, and the meeting concluded with Pete promising updates as the situation developed. Over the next month, negotiations happened behind closed doors. I was not directly involved, but Pete kept me informed. Karen's attorney tried to argue that the payments were legitimate, but the evidence was clear. She had approved them herself, in her own handwriting, on documents that were never properly voted on or recorded in meeting minutes. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Karen would repay $12,000, her portion of the misappropriated funds. The other board members would repay smaller amounts based on what they had received. In exchange, the HOA would not file criminal charges or pursue civil litigation. Karen and Greg put their house up for sale in August. They moved out in September, supposedly to be closer to their daughter in Phoenix, but everyone knew the real reason. She could not stay in a neighborhood where everyone knew what she had done. Linda and Brenda also moved within the year. Joyce, Frank's wife, stepped down from community involvement entirely and actually apologized to several neighbors for her part in the board's behavior. As for me, life returned to normal. The new board was reasonable and transparent. They hired a proper snow removal service for community streets, funded by the dues we were already paying. They stopped the nitpicky enforcement and focused on actual community improvements. Maria's kids got a new playground. The community pool, which had been neglected, was refurbished. The roads were repaired. People actually started attending HOA meetings again because they were productive instead of being Karen's personal fiefdom. I never did get an apology from Karen directly, but I did not need one. The vindication of the court case and the election was enough. That next winter, when the first major snowstorm hit, I was outside clearing my driveway when Pete drove by in a plow truck marked with the HOA logo. He waved, and I waved back. The community streets were cleared within hours by professional equipment, and no one got any threatening phone calls. Frank stopped by later that day with beer, and we sat in my garage with the door open, watching the snow fall. "You know," he said, "Joyce told me something interesting last night. She said that Karen had been planning to run for city council this year. This whole thing derailed that." "Good," I said. "The city does not need her either. She is lucky you did not push for criminal charges. Pete and the board made the right call. Getting the money back and getting her out was enough. No need to completely destroy her life." Frank nodded. "You are a better person than me. If someone had sued me like that, I would have pushed for everything. Maybe. But honestly, I am just glad it is over. I moved here for peace and quiet, not to be in the middle of HOA drama." "Well, thanks to you, we actually have peace and quiet now. The new board is doing a great job." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking beer and watching the neighborhood slowly disappear under fresh white snow. Kids were playing outside, building snowmen and having snowball fights. A few neighbors were out clearing their own driveways, chatting with each other. It felt like a real community, not a dictatorship. The next spring, Pete asked if I wanted to join the HOA board. Someone was stepping down due to work commitments, and he thought I would be good at it. I politely declined. I had done my civic duty by standing up to Karen and helping organize the recall. Now, I just wanted to live my life, write my code, and not think about bylaws and snow removal and parking violations. But I did agree to stay on as an informal advisor, someone the board could consult when weird situations came up. And they did come up, because HOAs attract weird situations like magnets attract metal. There was the incident with the guy who wanted to paint his house purple. There was the dispute over tree roots damaging a shared fence. There was even a situation involving someone's pet peacock that somehow ended up loose in the neighborhood for 3 days. But through it all, the new board handled things with common sense and fairness. They listened to residents. They followed proper procedures. They did not abuse their power or use the HOA as a personal weapon. It turned out that an HOA could actually function the way it was supposed to, as a community organization that maintained common areas and helped neighbors coexist peacefully. Who knew? As for the snow pile incident, it became neighborhood legend. New residents would hear about it and ask if it really happened. Kids would dare each other to pile snow in funny places, though never anything destructive. And every winter, when the first major storm hit, someone would jokingly ask me if I was planning to block the clubhouse again. I never did, of course. I did not need to. The point had been made, the battle had been won, and the community was better for it. Sometimes I think about that morning when Karen called at 6, demanding I clear the street. I think about how angry and frustrated I felt, how I could have just paid the fines and moved on, how I could have just kept my head down and let her keep bullying people. But I did not. I stood up, I fought back, and I did it in the most technically compliant, legally defensible, and deeply satisfying way possible. I followed her rules exactly as written, and when she did not like the results, I made her explain to a judge why her own rules were wrong. And that, more than anything, is what finally brought down her regime of petty tyranny. Not violence, not vandalism, just pure malicious compliance and a willingness to stand up to someone who thought they were untouchable. David, my lawyer friend, still brings it up sometimes when we have lunch. He says it is his favorite case, even though he barely had to do anything. He loves telling other lawyers about the time an HOA president sued someone for obeying her orders too literally and got destroyed in court. The story even made it into a local news article. A reporter heard about it and wrote a piece about HOA overreach and how one homeowner fought back. They interviewed me, Pete, and even tried to interview Karen, though she declined. The article ran with the headline "Snowball Effect," how one homeowner's compliance brought down an HOA board. It was a bit sensationalized, but mostly accurate. It led to a broader conversation in Colorado Springs about HOA regulations and oversight. The city council even held hearings about implementing stronger protections for homeowners against HOA abuses. I testified at one of those hearings, telling my story to a room full of officials and other homeowners with their own horror stories. Some had lost their homes to HOA foreclosures over minor fee disputes. Others had been fined into bankruptcy. A few had been discriminated against or targeted by board members with personal grudges. My situation was relatively minor compared to some of theirs, but it illustrated the same problem. HOAs had too much power and not enough accountability. The city ended up passing new regulations requiring HOAs to follow stricter procedures before levying fines, mandating clearer communication of rule changes, and creating an appeals process for homeowners who felt they were being treated unfairly. It was not perfect, but it was something. And it all started because I decided to pile snow in front of a clubhouse. Looking back now, a few years later, I realized that the whole experience taught me something important. Systems of power, even small ones like an HOA, rely on people's willingness to comply out of fear or convenience. When someone finally says no and forces the system to justify itself, That is when change becomes possible. Karen was used to people backing down. She counted on it. The threat of fines, of legal action, of being labeled a troublemaker, it usually worked. Most people just wanted to avoid conflict and would pay or comply even when they knew it was wrong. But once one person stands firm, others find their courage too. Frank started helping with the snow. Maria signed the recall petition. Pete spoke up at meetings. Dozens of other homeowners joined in, sharing their stories and demanding better. One person cannot change a system alone, but one person can start the process. That is what I did, even though I did not really intend to. I just wanted to make a point about the absurdity of Karen's snow removal demands. Instead, I ended up being part of something bigger. A community that took back control from a tyrant. A system that got reformed, even if just slightly. A neighborhood that learned to stand up for itself. These days, I still live in the same house. I still work from home, writing code and attending virtual meetings. I still keep my lawn nice and my driveway clear. And when it snows, I still handle my own property like a responsible homeowner, but I do not clear the streets. Because now we have a service that does it properly, funded by our HOA dues, the way it should have been all along. Sometimes I see the clubhouse and remember that massive pile of snow, 6 feet high and blocking the entrance, a monument to petty resistance. It is gone now, melted away years ago, but the memory remains. And every time Karen's name comes up in conversation, which happens less and less as time goes on, someone always mentions the snow pile. It has become her legacy, the thing she will be remembered for in Meadowbrook Heights. Not the landscaping improvements she claimed to care about, not the bylaws she spent hours crafting, not the events she organized or the committees she chaired, just the snow pile. The physical manifestation of her overreach and the community's response. I have been told that Karen is doing fine in Arizona. She lives in a community without an HOA, which is probably for the best. Greg apparently retired early, and they travel a lot. Their kids visit more often now that there is less tension. Part of me hopes she learned something from the experience. That maybe she understands now that power should be used to help people, not control them. That rules should serve a purpose beyond satisfying someone's need for authority. But honestly, I do not think about her much anymore. She is part of my past, a character in a story I tell sometimes when the subject of HOA horror stories comes up. The neighborhood has moved on. New families have moved in, replacing not just Karen and her allies, but other people too as life naturally shifts and changes. The new residents hear the story secondhand, a legend about the previous HOA president and the guy who buried the clubhouse in snow. Some of them do not even believe it really happened. It sounds too perfect, too much like revenge fantasy rather than actual events. But it did happen. Every bit of it. I have the court documents to prove it. I have the photos of the snow pile. I have the emails from Karen, the meeting minutes, the recall petition with 78 signatures. It all really happened in Colorado Springs, in Meadowbrook Heights, because an HOA president decided that she could make arbitrary rules and everyone would just comply. She was wrong. And now, every winter when the snow falls, I watch it accumulate on my driveway, on my lawn, on the street. And I know that I only have to worry about my little corner of the world. The rest is handled by professionals who are paid fairly for their work and do not have to deal with threatening phone calls before dawn. That is how it should be. That is how it is now. And that is a pretty good ending to the story. The snow falls, I clear my driveway, and life goes on. Peaceful, quiet, exactly what I wanted when I bought this house in the first place. No more HOA drama. No more Karen. No more snow piles blocking clubhouses, just a normal neighborhood with normal people trying to live their normal lives. And honestly, that is the best victory of all.